Resume audio recording, and this is the session on courage. Today is May 31st, and I'll let everyone in.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining today. Thank you for coming to listen. Thank you for coming to talk. Thank you for a moment of conversation, several minutes of hopefully some peaceful reflection. Unfortunately, we're having way too much peaceful time alone. So thank you for gathering together for a good conversation. I'd like to thank Verena and Fernando for joining me for today's conversation on courage. Verena, other than welcoming everyone like I just did, don't think I have anything else, any other thoughts right now to add. So thank you for agreeing to take the lead talking about courage today. Verena, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Hirsch. I was, I suppose, at first a little bit surprised. I'm not a fighter of any particular renown. I'm not necessarily someone I would put myself in the forefront of courage. But the world has changed quite a lot recently. And just over a year ago, I graduated from medical school. And I have spent my first year of practice in a bit of turmoil. The fall was pretty, getting my feet under me. The winter was watching, flu season and this brewing of a global pandemic, which has been frightening and has upended systems, the country and the world over. As a trainee in an area that is not too heavily affected at this point, I've been lucky to not be thrust beyond my capabilities at this point. This has happened in other places, and some of the stories out of New York City are truly heartbreaking. The extent to which people in my shoes, these new graduates, are stretching themselves and in some cases absolutely despairing at what they are and aren't able to do to save people. In this area, I've joined with the Department of Anesthesiology, and we're probably best known for putting people to sleep for surgeries, but are also people who work in intensive care units and in the alleviation of chronic pain. And I have, again, been relatively lucky not to be thrust beyond my capabilities at this point, but I have watched a number of the staff physicians I've worked with take the forefront in caring for patients in intensive care, these patients who are on ventilators, who are on the brink of death and sometimes do fall over it. And they have kind of taken that lead in caring for the victims of this pandemic. And I admire them greatly. And that's sort of what I was thinking. Well, I'm a doctor. We go forward knowing that we may have to respond to casualties, to plague, to pestilence, to accidents, to natural disasters. And it doesn't strike you until you're in the thick of it. And this case in particular was, not a few days or a few weeks in the wake of a flood or a hurricane or a tornado or anything else that kind of strikes and recedes, but it's an ongoing question of how worse will things get? Will they get better? When will it come back? And so I have watched my colleagues take their duty to be physicians and to heal and to persevere in the face of that. And as I've been thinking about definitions of courage, we've thought of, well, I've been talking with those around me and I've been thinking on it myself. And there's certainly doing one's duty in the face of difficulty, in the face of danger. There's somewhat other, and some of the other ideas we've come up with are performing an act, an important act, and a virtuous act in the face of negative consequences or of personal cost. You're performing a virtuous action despite risks. And I think that's the important part of courage, is that it has those two components. It's the performance of an action that is important. It can't just be any action, but it must be one that's important, one that's necessary, one that is good, one that is virtuous and in keeping with one's values. And the second component is that it must come at a risk. It must come at some form of cost. It must come in the face of fear. And that courage does, in fact, take both of those components to be truly a worthy act. And at this point, I would like to kind of solicit some other definitions, and we're starting with the definitions at this point. And Hirsch and my companions here in our virtual discussion, what are your thoughts on the meaning of courage? How do you define it? What does it take for something to be a courageous act?
Verena, thank you for getting us started on this conversation. I'm quite moved by your comments about the modern world, and we cannot escape the modern world. I particularly like your characterization that without some risk, without some element of fear, something to be overcome, then actions are probably not particularly courageous. Matching those with what is right is crucial, in my opinion. I personally believe that, and this sort of flows back into my thoughts about the virtues as a whole being a set of tools for thinking, for tools for improving your thinking, and by improving your thinking, improving your actions. I believe that recognizing the opportunity, the moment when a courageous action is needed, is an important element. And sometimes the action may be words, maybe speaking up, rather than, a physical action. I think that's an important element that, frankly, I've said before, I'm not a medieval scholar. I don't know if that has a basis in the Middle Ages, but I think that recognizing when an action is needed is one of the root activities. I welcome thoughts from somebody else. I'm a little verklempt. Does anybody else have a variation, anything to add on definitions?
And I think we'll be open to continuing to fine-tune our definitions as our discussion continues. The medieval concept of courage, and especially as a knightly virtue, was in the context of combatants, individuals who were expected to demonstrate their courage in a very physical sense, on the battlefield, on the tournament field. And the hazard they were taking at that point was a very physical one. was it the courage they exhibited where it was hazarding their own bodies? And I think, like many of the other virtues we have discussed, is that this may need to be reimagined a little bit in our current modern era. Our hobby, as much as we love it and as much as it is a deep-seated part of ourselves, is it's not a literal battlefield. We take to the field in good humor and in good sport to enjoy this friendly competition. And in that sense, it is not taking to a tournament, taking to a battle is not quite the same hazard as one would expect from a literal medieval knight. So a question I'd like to pose is, to what extent does courage play a role in our tournament game and in our battles? Or may there be kind of better ways to characterize glorious deeds that are done in that context?
I like what His Grace Garrick says in his musing about how, you know, sometimes that courage is losing a close fight and accepting that defeat when you may or may not have been in love with it. I think that kind of translates to our game very well.
Emmerich, I agree. Sometimes accepting defeat in tournament or battle is a courageous moment.
I'd like to step in for a sec. I think that a big defining aspect for us as combatants in our current Middle Ages, and a defining difference between tournament combat and combat on the warfield. You sign up for a tournament, you know that you're going to have at least 2 fights, and that's set in stone. It's not in and of itself defined as a courageous act, except for maybe that very first time as a young new fighter that you actually sign up for the list. But those fights are going to happen, and the only consequence comes that if you truly had an issue or truly had a fear and you yielded the bout. But either way, you're going to step onto that field twice, and you're going to be put in a situation where you have to fight twice at the very least. On the war field, I think, is where we see or experience true acts of courage within the context of our fighting culture. You know, sometimes it's hard to stare down the pike wall or to crash that first line of great weapons. And we see a lot of varying aspects in that. The longer you do this, the somewhat easier it becomes to do those things. Your ability to see things on the warfield increases. But every time that you do that and you see those individuals who are recognized as, to coin a phrase, the war gods, those battle-hardened men that we look to for example, show the one aspect of our game on the fighting field that takes true courage, and that is to throw yourself in the fray. It's the one place where you truly hazard your body. You're gonna get beat up, you're gonna take shots from the blind, And in all the things that we do, I think that that defining moment is found on the battlefield.
Connell, I agree that in terms of physical challenge, the battlefield seems to be the place. I haven't never really been afraid on the field as a general rule. I mean, short of a moment where I was put in a dangerous situation, but I know fighters, especially newer or smaller fighters, who have admitted that every time there's a press on a bridge, they're scared. They're scared physically for their safety. So, but I think that's only one aspect of courage to me. In fact, Ramon Lull specifically talks about how courage is an attribute of the soul, not one of the body. So I think while those physical things in the field are the most obvious, I think to negate or discount all the parts that are decisions of action, what we're going to do, how we're going to deal with problems. It's easy for us not to view that directly as courage in the same way, but I think there's just two different aspects of same ideas.
It's an interesting point, right? If bravery or courage is right action in the face of a reasonable fear, if you've read the rules of the list, if you trust your opponent, it's kind of hard to manifest genuine fear at lay on, whether that's during a tournament or during a melee. That's not to say that there isn't some physical risk when charging down the wall or charging down the pikes, right? Everyone has twisted a knee. Everyone has, of a certain age, has started to feel shoulder pain, right? These are all very real things that we're all genuinely afraid of. But for our veterans, right, that doesn't really slow us down. Ferd made the point of some of the new fighters. I think the experience of the heart racing and charging across the bridge and feeling that moment of fear is very real in that moment. They'll eventually kind of, after experience, get past it. To bring it back around, I guess, to a thought of courage being a part of the soul. I think in the SCA, and I'm going to slightly change the subject a little bit, and I hesitate to do it, with what the SCA is facing today, what the modern world's facing today, what Callantyre in specific is facing today, courage is going to be seeing something that needs to stop and having the courage to stand up to your friends and tell them to stop.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I feel that the definition of courage being is, in light of what is reasonable fear? Well, what is reasonable fear to one person and reasonable fear to another person may be different. Also, it may also be fear, an unreasonable fear. Sometimes the unreasonable fears are the hardest ones to overcome. And the struggle is entirely internal. And although you may not know the person is showing courage, I feel we have to acknowledge that when they do step out of their comfort zone, or when they do overcome an unreasonable fear or a reasonable fear and are able to take action as a result.
I like what you guys are saying on that, and the whole idea of courage and bravery kind of being sort of interchangeable. But it also comes down to the community that you're a part of. If you're looking at war and a jihad comes screaming across the border, they are brave in their side's eyes. We think they're idiots for going kamikaze on stuff. Like, you have to really take a step back and realize and recognize the virtues of the community that you're participating in order to support and encourage the bravery and courage that you would like to see grow. So, like, your idea of what the greater good is kind of based upon your community that you've built.
Pat, I like the way you put that in terms of the community. You know, we're here as a very, very small representative group from one community, and we already have very diverse perspectives on what courage or bravery means within this group or within our community. And being able to take your perspective to another person, another group, and consider what they think is a very useful skill.
I think it's one we can remember, especially as His Majesty brought up, it's going to look different, and there are different forms of bravery that are going to be brought to the fore in issues that may arise. And the more time we spend apart, it's not the physical prowess as much anymore. Sometimes it's being brave enough to admit you're struggling, that you miss your friends, the emotional side of the struggle.
I also like Kat tied it back into the community, because if we go back to 2 weeks ago's discussion on faith, when we said it was a belief, it's something bigger than ourselves, and that means if we're looking at other virtues as part of that as well, it's being part of something bigger than ourselves. That community and how the community defines things become important for us too, I would think.
Yeah. You can't have one without the others. The whole links in the chain and circling back around. Supporting your community means that you have to have those centralized ideals and values. So this is a good time to reflect on what those are and what you're actually fighting for.
So I think that there are many layers to courage. And I think that all of us, when we go to an event, see examples of it. Every time we have someone new stand up in court and we introduce them, that's a lot of courage for them, one, coming to their first event, meeting all these strange people, getting called up into court. And I mean, it builds off of that. And as we, I guess, age through society, that's kind of normal. We don't maybe look at it the same. But I think that we see and are surrounded by examples of everyday little courage at an SEA event.
Mm-hmm. Taking that big first step is a big one. Kind of do it, but no.
Verena said that in her definition of courage that it had to include a risk. How is that a real risk, or is it a perceived risk in order to be courage?
Well, Ferd, I think that the biggest thing goes back to what Rhiannon said, and that is that everyone's view of what is a courageous act or where it steps over into that is based on your perception. Some people are more confident, and confidence often comes with time. But for each and every one of us, I think it is on us to figure out or to know where that's at, because we all have a different perspective.
That different perspective is very personal. Connell, when you were talking about tournament versus battlefield, I actually remember the first time I signed up for a tournament, and I went over to the list table, and there was a novice tournament and there was a regular tournament. I was like, oh no, should I do both? And it was very simple. It's like, sure, I get to fight more times. I don't expect to do well in either one, but my bar for embarrassing myself as a fighter on the field was negligible because I knew I was new. But that's going to be different for a lot of different people. Some people are going to want to practice for longer instead of just jumping into a tournament and going, yeah, I'm probably going to lose, but let's go. And so I consider that to have been negligible courage on my part. But that's my personal perspective on it. Similarly, I agree with Fernando about, you know, what we do fighting in tournament or in the battlefield is pretty safe. And I feel that pretty strongly. I could probably, a single digit number of times I have been afraid on the field. And at least one of those was in a press shortly after one of my knee surgeries, when I was afraid I was gonna be re-injured. But that's the exception, not the rule. And I think that the conversation as it's moved forward and talked about, you know, personal everyday courage is the broader conversation is actually much more interesting to me than the conversation about fighting, because it's even more personal.
And I wanted to mention a thought I had. Being courageous is not merely lashing out or shouting in the instant. Anybody can lash out. A coward can lash out in an instant, or shout or yell. That's something that courage is not. And I think we might mistake a sudden bluster as courage sometimes, even for ourselves personally. Like, oh, I got up and I said my piece, and perhaps that wasn't courageous. That was merely making yourself feel good about yourself.
I like the comment that Joel just made. I like the comment that Joel just made in chat there. It might be worth sharing if you're willing. Okay. He said courage is always a relative thing, something you can do without a second thought. Maybe someone else's fear that took multiple internal eye of the tiger pep talks to try. So just another version of how relative these things are for us.
Very good comment. I think that the tail end there, in multiple internal eye of the tiger pep talks to even try it, speaks to the personal nature. And oh boy, I had something I was going to say and I forgot it. But sometimes, I think that ties into Rihanna's differentiation between reasonable fears and unreasonable fears. Because even if your reasonable, rational self recognizes that you have an unreasonable fear as part of your person, that doesn't solve it. It doesn't go away. So you may reasonably have to give yourself pep talks and say, okay, I can deal with this. I can get around that. But I think it's interesting that in my mind, these two comments about giving yourself a pep talk and the idea of knowing you have an unreasonable fear are absolutely related. Not to even mention the reasonable fears.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, this is my first time joining these, so I wasn't sure if it was more open forum or tabletop discussion. Everyone's talking about how courage is such a personal thing. How then can we recognize courage in others?
Good question, Nora. We definitely started with definitions and commonalities, because I consider courage to be very personal, but I also consider each and every one of the virtues to be commonalities that we share. The idea of courage is a common idea that we strive for.
Nora, I'm not sure that we can always recognize it, because a person speaking up for someone who needs someone to speak up for. We don't know if they felt, if they felt that was a risk to themselves. We don't know if that was just their automatic. It's easy for them to step up and do. Same thing. I don't know if a guy charges in the bridge battle because because he didn't think twice about it, or because he had to work himself up. I mean, unless you know someone well, motivation and it's going to be really hard to ever truly judge. And it applies to almost every one of the virtues too. I think we look at the actions and we don't, without knowing what's behind them, we can only go off kind of community standards or knowing the person, maybe. Thoughts?
I had another facet I wanted to add to this. And I think His Majesty just put in a question, is following up on Joel and Renji's points, does this mean that courage or bravery is action with forethought, with the response being perhaps intent rather than forethought? And I wanted to add a kind of facet of question to that, is that it seems like a lot of us kind of go out maybe when we're afraid we're going to twist our knee again, maybe when something's hurting a little, when we're not at 100%. And then there's a possibility, what about action without forethought? At what point do we add a facet of recklessness into asking ourselves whether something was a courageous action, whether something was a rash action?
I'd like to speak.
Forethought. Go ahead.
So go ahead.
Forethought, intent. I would look at what the person stood to gain at the end of it. Were they in the moment defending something they feared losing, or were they acting in defense of another? What did they stand to gain in that moment? Would be how I would judge. In hindsight, how I would judge forethought or intent.
I think that we can look at courage on a sliding scale because it is certainly situational. An example is a modern soldier, especially these days, put in a position where you may have to act to get the mission done, to protect your comrades, to protect civilians. Oftentimes, as they say, best laid plans or plans are only as good as the start of the conflict, and everything else within those guidelines is by the seat of your pants, and it's certainly situational. So, a real world hazard versus what we do in our weekend medieval game where we know we're going to get hit by a stick or have to stand up and speak in front of a crowd of people who can look very scary, at first glance, may be viewed as very different aspects of courage. One thing that I can say from personal experience is I was a paratrooper. I jumped out of a lot of different aircraft. I was good at what I did. I was highly trained. Every time I got on a plane, I had to tell myself, you're going to jump out the door. You're going to get up. You're going to jump out the door, right? Every time you look out that door, except for the adrenaline junkies who fling themselves willy-nilly, I had to tell myself, that I was going to do that. Certainly there's a greater hazard involved in something like that, but it was the job I signed up for. Much like being a doctor in these trying times, first responder, cop. Your job comes with hazard. It doesn't mean that it's not a courageous act for you to get up every day, put on your spiritual armor, put on your gun, put on your badge, put on your scrubs, and go face whatever is waiting for you during that day. So in my opinion, it's definitely a sliding scale.
I think, our motivations for being courageous are probably equally varied. Whether it's not disappoint yourself, not disappoint the people around you, knowing that you already signed up for the job. I suspect there are many motivations for courage. Does that change anything about the act of being courageous?
I don't think so, Ferd. I think that whatever the motivation is for being courageous, it doesn't, or the reason for being courageous, it doesn't change the fact that it is courage. And in fact, I don't think anybody has to notice for it to be a virtue. It does. No one else has to see it happening. And in fact, especially with courage, I think of the several virtues. Probably most of the time it happens, no one else is aware, or perhaps the person's very closest friend knows that that person is at that moment being courageous. There's some things that may be more obviously a risk, but there again are many things that you won't even know that person is putting that out there, putting themselves out there, and putting themselves at risk, or a perceived risk. So I think this is one where it's a very, very personal virtue, I think.
Does that mean that courage is either thankless or its own reward?
Absolutely. It is its own reward.
One could say that all of the virtues are their own reward.
So in order for something to be a virtue, or to be considered a virtue, it seems to me that we have to decide as a society, large or small, that is something that we value, right? That Alphonsus called it a good habit that men possess. So what makes something a good thing for us? There has to be some kind of positive for the community before we would get to that point. Before we get to the point that people, that so many of the medieval authors spoke about courage. And the Song of Roland talks about how that, you have to stand so that no one will sing a shameful song about you afterwards. And, there's so many kind of equivalent things where they pushed, obviously they were pushing this virtue. Why is courage a benefit for our society? And I ask that question both writ large and small, both within our game and within our society in general. Why is that still a virtue to us? Why was it a virtue to them?
We talk about it a lot in the context of the soldier, right? We're going to refer to these as the knightly virtues. I guess we can talk about it in that context, that we would, in period, need people willing to take the field and name the king or the name of their god, right? And that courage was not only a self-enrichment for the individual trying to pursue that virtue, but a net positive for the community. I think that remains to be true today, right? Using a previous example, looking your friends in the face, telling them to stop when something doesn't benefit the community, it can be difficult. I think that continues to be a valuable asset to not only us as a society, but the modern world as well.
Thank you, Lucian. That actually answered the question I was thinking in my mind, because Honora and Rhiannon said, you know, is the virtue its own reward? And the answer is yeah, you should. But then it's like, if the virtue is its own reward, why are they held as valuable by everyone? And actually, your answer about when everyone behaves in these ways, everyone benefits. They benefit as individuals, and the group, the community, benefits from people acting courageously in some cases, or virtuously, if you take it that way.
Yeah,
I
what you
think in
said.
that way it really becomes an important and selfless act to really participate as a whole. It's not about you as an individual anymore. It's really being selfless.
Or back to our belief about something bigger than ourselves.
You have to, if you're going to have everybody on the same page with, like you said, picking which values are we going to support here? What are the pillars of our community? What ground do we stand on?
Yeah, so again, to go back to the idea of risk and the selflessness, you know, if there's personal risk, whether that's to reputation or, you know, body, and let's say a more period context where in combat you may be killed, the idea that, you know, the ancient idea that no greater love hath someone than to lay down their life for their friends, or in this case, you know, our comrades in arms, or the kingdom, or, you know, whatever. You know, this is why courage is not just its own reward. It certainly is, but there is a greater social benefit to these things, which was the whole point of having a class of people who embodied these virtues. So there was a benefit to society, as well as to, you know, this was not just, you know, a self-improvement program, you know, in the Middle Ages. This was something bigger than that.
Arthur, what was its purpose then for the larger group overall, of the virtues in general? I mean, if we're pushing these mostly towards knights at the time, what's our societal benefit?
Right. So I think, you know, if you go back and look at Aristotle's definition of virtues, is those things that make life good, right? So to live the good life, that's a big piece of it, right? And within the medieval concept of virtue, we have the corresponding negative attributes of the vices. So, you know, that the virtues are increasing is almost goes without saying that there will then be a decreasing in vice, which are the things that corrupt and pollute and destroy society among humans. So I think there's this idea, you know, and within the written context, you talk about the knightly virtues, but they also talk about, you know, the virtues in the context of society writ large. And finding a list of, you know, 7 or 9 or even 12 virtues is pretty hard. If you read the different authors, there are ever increasing, apparently, attributes that get listed as virtues depending on who you're reading. And I think the idea is that certain ones are more appropriate to certain classes, perhaps, in the medieval context.
I like this idea that there is more than one virtue, mostly because it sounds like they can't be held alone. If you only have courage, you might be working towards the wrong goals. We should be working either towards self-actualization or the betterment of society. We only know what those things are with the other virtues working in concert.
I think that's a great point, Ariel, especially in our current Middle Ages. But to go back and address what Fernando was saying, from a purely medieval aspect, I don't, honestly, through all the readings, the nobility were out for themselves. They didn't care for the body society at large. War for knights was a way to earn lands and money. It's the rare individual in medieval history that hazards themselves for the greater good. Charnay throwing himself in front of the king, burying the oriflamme of France, or Roland holding a bridge, or William Marshall the rear guard to protect Henry from Richard. Those are rare instances. In general, I think that the knightly caste in medieval history, they were realistically self-serving, and we choose in our current Middle Ages to improve upon that, to be better than that, and that's where community comes in.
You're not wrong, right? All the writings on all the virtues, not just courage, were written by philosophers and poets, right? That we're striving for an ideal. To expect everyone at all times, at any period of time, to actually achieve those ideals is maybe expecting too much.
But aim high. If we don't set our expectations higher than our base or instincts, then we won't improve. And I would say that even the most calculating nobleman in period who went to war out of greed probably masked their actions in words of virtue when they could, even if they knew deep down that they were really just out for themselves.
There are folks who argue that a lot of the virtues exist for very pragmatic reasons, primarily for pragmatic reasons, that courage is about getting young men to risk their life and limb, in defense of a state, or that generosity is about, getting goods shared around other people. That if those arguments become big enough, then Hirsch, does the idea of cloaking, where does the idea of cloaking our regular actions under the guise of virtues actually become to the virtue? Well, in the end, does it matter what I think if I always do the right thing? If I'm doing it, does it matter why I did it in the end? That could be a question for anybody, not just Hirsch.
If I may, Ferd, I think that is as dangerous a road as its counterpoint. Doing the wrong thing for the right reasons is still the wrong thing. Doing the right thing for the wrong reasons are still the wrong reasons. I think they are both equally dangerous and equally hard to avoid in the practicalities of real life. Mostly it's usually a mix of all of that. But I think to say that as long as I always do the right thing, it doesn't matter what my intentions are, what my goals are, as long as I'm doing the right thing. I'm not sure that is actually a virtue. That might be just pragmatic politics.
That's interesting. That's a good view of it, because it might mean that yes, society still benefits, but it wasn't exactly the intent. Again, going back to that, is still not a virtue.
And that I also think that actually, Rocco, what you said about the two ways doing things can still be wrong. One of the purposes of the virtues, in my opinion, is that people who are believed, when their actions and their intentions seem to diverge, then people will question them. And once again, the virtues can be a tool for having a conversation with someone to better understand their intentions.
We still have a few people we haven't heard from at all. I'd love to see if anybody's being quiet, wants to share something.
I'm also not opposed to. We can also wind down at any time, but as Fernando said, if you have something else, other questions and comments, please don't hesitate to speak up.
I think one of the things, courage can be linked into it, and it's the whole, you have to have all of these virtues together, because there's not just the virtue to follow to be a good citizen in your community. It's the extremism that's dangerous. Like Rockman said, yeah, you can do it right. Two wrong ways don't make it right. So if you temper extremism with the compassion and empathy of the other side and with the other virtues, it can give you the courage to stand against accusers, or it can give you bravery to say no or to say yes in the right situations. And just instead of constantly thinking, I have the courage to fight, maybe you have the courage to just to stand, to take a breath, to hold your ground and just find balance, like leading from the front and not just doing anything impulsively, but really tempering that cutting edge of passion with compassion. Because these riots right now are freaking terrifying and people need to just simmer.
That's exactly what I was thinking, Kat. I specifically asked Verena to talk about the ER, and I had no idea when I scheduled this that the other major backdrop for this conversation wasn't going to be the pandemic. It was going to be rightful riots. I mean, that's one way to look at this. The discussion of who's in the right in the modern world when there is a riot is one where the virtues, I believe, cut to the truth. And there's a lot of disappointing things going on in the world right now, but I am absolutely in favor of voices being heard. And conversations like this are sometimes sometimes I don't want to have them in a purely medieval context, because it feels like putting my head in the sand.
Go ahead.
One of the other discussion points that I had listed out was, how does the concept of relative power play into whether someone is performing a courageous act or not? And I had kind of initially thought about that in the context of our game. How does a duke or a knight standing up to someone who's maybe being boorish differ in courage from someone who's at their third event standing up to someone who's being boorish? And there's certainly ways in which that plays out in the modern world as well. Someone who can afford a better lawyer versus someone who can't. Someone who is living on a razor's edge when it comes to their budget. How do they use their time? What are the risks that they're, assuming upon themselves that someone else might not have to? And kind of look at power as a point when it comes to understanding an action as courageous or perhaps less so.
So I'm sorry to jump in right here. I have pretty strong feelings on the subject. And I know I've spoken a lot, so I promise I'll try to make this fast. In the context of the SCA, it takes almost no courage for me to stand up to somebody right
Yeah.
now. I have zero to lose from standing up to somebody in my position. When I step down, it'll almost remain the same, right? There's almost no courage for me to stand up to someone who's being boorish and tell them to shut their mouth. It takes almost nothing. And so a big pat on the back to anybody who can stand up to someone of my station and tell me that I've done wrong. And if you can do that, if you can have that courage, then I will absolutely listen to you. Please take me to task if I ever deserve it.
Pat spoke about extremism being the danger in some of these. And maybe, we keep coming back to a lot of times about how the virtues support each other and hold each other. And maybe when we achieve appropriate balance between virtues, maybe that's what avoids extremism. I mean, how using your prowess or your or faith extremely too far may be held back by temperance and prudence. And sometimes it's really hard for us to see some of these things, especially as we look at more and more virtues listed on a list. Maybe a reason that the earliest lists of what later led to the virtues that we use, the cardinal virtues, started with Plato and were talked about by Thomas Aquinas and a bunch of other people over the years, Alfonso X of Spain. But they looked at prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice as the four cardinal virtues that were later expanded on a lot, of course. But I think if we can keep those four in balance, it's a lot easier to look at that than trying to get into where's the appropriate spot for franchise or for generosity as individuals. But if somehow we could keep those four big picture items in balance at all times, our society might be society, small and large, might be pretty different places.
Fernando, the word balance really resonates with me, and I am. This is also a good opportunity to say I picked Duke Garrick's 8 virtues for 8 conversations on the chivalric virtues. The 4 cardinal virtues you speak of are absolutely a good example as well, and there are many lists of virtues that by no means stop at 8. They exceed 10, they go to 12 or 14. I don't know how many lists of virtues there are, but the idea of balance, I think, transcends the question of how many virtues do you have, because you need some of all of them.
I just recently found a cool picture from Ramon Lull that I had not looked at or in detail before. And it basically includes, it's a circle with all the vices and virtues around it, and then lines pointing from one to the other. And I realized that every virtue points to every other one, every vice points to every other one. And which is some of the things we've said in a lot of our discussions over the years about how they're all important, everyone ties to each other. But it also kind of definitely makes that balance. And when I spoke of the 4, I only mentioned those that it can be really confusing to try to balance out many, many things. If you're looking for balance, 2 things are easy to balance. 3, you can still do. 4, you start getting 20, 15, it starts to become a much more complicated conversation. So.
This has been a phenomenal conversation. This has been fantastic. I appreciate everybody's time. I am going to close. I'm going to close the way I have each time, with a thing and a toast.
Hirsch, if I may, I really want to interject this earlier, but it's an obvious mundanity. I think that we've talked about the riots, we've talked about the pandemic, and it brings a somber tone to this. I think that one of the things that we can take away from this weekend, at least these last 19 hours, and it pertains directly to courage, are astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, who, after 10 years of stagnation in our country, put themselves on a rocket, and it's tantamount to first flight. There's been no rocket like this ever in the past, and no capsule like this. And they flew to the space station, and it was seamless. And for 19 hours, I had a hope and joy that I haven't had since the first day of this year. And it was spectacular. And those two men encapsulate the virtue of courage. And it's obvious to all, or should be obvious to all. And I wanted to mention their names before you close.
Connell, thank you so much. That lent a balance to the modern topics that came into this conversation that I could. Thank you. I agree. It was a phenomenal flight. It was courageous. And I hope that each and every one of us can find, moments where we can be courageous in our lives, and also look up, whether it's up to the sky, up to the stars, to orbit, or just looking around us to find courageous moments to admire and to strive to better ourselves. These are the spurs I was knighted with. I am cutting out. Technology is fickle. Let me see if I have. These spurs were put on me by my brother. He wore them before me, so they represent a lot of things to me. They represent family. They represent a reminder to always try to improve, to always strive. And I hope that each and every one of you can continue to always strive. And for a toast this week, I have a cider. It's actually one of the very, very few homebrew ciders from my fridge. I don't recall who gave it to us, but it still effervesces. So my friends, to your health.
To your health.
Salud.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes.
Great to see all your faces.